Yeah,
Are we recording?
Yeah, all started.
Great.
Okay, so over to me. Right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the examination hearings into the Mid-Sussex Site Allocations DPD. My name is Mike Fox. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination into the soundness of this plan. It's 9:30. Thank you all for getting here, getting on time, and the hearings are now open. Can everybody hear me and can everybody see me? So I'm getting no indications to the contrary. It is being recorded on YouTube. I'm informed, reliably informed. I'm not going to go through the whole spiel that I went through yesterday by way of introduction, because most of you are in your day 2 now, but I am aware that some of you are new. Welcome to you. Just to say that when you first speak, that's the time to make your introduction and say who you are and who you represent. So I won't be going through a long list right now. What else needs to be said at this stage? Breaks. I like to have a mid-morning break, so around 11, an hour off at lunch, 1 to 2 usually. And again, if we're still going by 3:30, and we were yesterday, so it might well be today, bearing in mind the topic, then I'll have a break again about 3:30 for 10-15 minutes, something like that. I am aware that 1 or 2 of you were like desperate to get away because you had caring responsibilities of one sort or another. I felt quite bad about that. And what I would say is that any of you who have a caring responsibility, then you just leave when you need to. I quite understand that. Obviously, that's your priority, and that's very important. In terms of housekeeping matters, there were 2 things I asked for yesterday, both in relation to matter 1. And the first of these is a list, both asking of the council. The first is a list of which media outlets were used by the council. So that's the whole range: social media, radio, whatever you've used, as well as newspapers. And also the second thing I asked for was a note on policies SA 33 to 38. If you remember, we had a discussion about how appropriate or otherwise they are in this document, which is a kind of part 2 plan. So the council have undertaken to do that. And I've also indicated I would give once that comes in, I will give a week's deadline for anybody else who wants to respond. In fact, that invitation to response will go to everything that I ask of whichever party. I'll always give the opportunity for other parties to answer back, as it were. Charlotte, was there anything else that needs to be mentioned at the outset?
No, I don't think so. Nope. Nope.
Right.
Nope.
I mean, if you think of something, then just flag it up.
Thanks.
So,
Thanks.
sorry. So we're looking at matter 3 on housing. We'll be looking at various housing matters for several days, but today we'll be looking primarily at the quantitative and qualitative aspects of housing provision. So we're on to matter 3, and we've got my MIQs as a basis for the agenda to go through. And the strap line for matter 3 is: does the plan deliver both the quantitative and qualitative aspects of housing provision to meet Mid-Sussex's requirements over the plan period in accordance with national policy? And If we start with 3.1, which is new homes quantum, this is picked up in policies SA10 and SA11. And my first little Roman numeral here is the updated minimum residual requirement for Mid Sussex, which has been reduced from 2,439 units in policy DP4 of the district plan to 1,280 units in the submitted plan. Is that supported by the evidence? The council's statement, briefly summarised, says that it's all set out in their topic paper, and the reduction is based on the additional completions in the intervening period and commitments since the developed district plan was adopted, and an amended windfall allowance. And that it's hardly surprising in the council's view that as time goes on and more planning permissions are granted, etc., that the figure goes down. So it's now down to 1,280 at regulation 19 stage. So just very briefly summarising other people. The DHA planning say, no, it's not supported by the evidence. It's predicated on an unrealistic housing trajectory for the delivery of strategic sites. Nexus planning, again, no. It's calculated on a significant reliance or based on a significant reliance on the delivery of strategic sites and unrealistic assumptions in relation to delivery, namely in respect to the Northern Arc. Barton Wilmore, again, no. The residual figure fails to take account of any qualitative housing assessment, and they refer to the specialist care accommodation, extra care C2. We will park that for the time being because we have a question on qualitative housing further down the batting list. So we don't need to go into that now right away. Turley say they've got a concern over lack of evidence regarding delivery rates. Judith Ashton Associates, we've got a table showing how SA10 in this plan compares to policy DP4 in the adopted plan. Helpful table, thank you for that. Savills for Charterhouse strategic land say the evidence is not sufficiently robust for the reduced residual requirement to be utilised as the appropriate figure. And they also point out, for example, that the sustainability appraisal identifies that 713 of the 3,500 units in the Northern Arc it's acceptable come forward beyond the plan period. Lichfields, that the development plan as a whole needs to plan positively for the area to meet its needs and to respond to rapid change, as MPPF 11A says. And in the light of that, they have concerns about the delivery assumptions. Again, the dependence on the Northern Arc is highlighted. And the latest trajectory, if I can say it, trajectory, as per document MSDC-01, is not considered to be justified for several reasons, and they go into those, and maybe Lichfields, if they want, can elaborate on those. Andrew Black, that the rationale is not supported by the evidence, particularly around windfall sites. Gladman, basically combination of low contingency, optimistic delivery assumptions and historical delivery rates, say it would be more appropriate if the plan allocated more non-strategic sites on land in or adjacent to higher tier settlements. Lawrence Foote for Lord Lytton states that in their view there's a failure of strategy in insisting on major sites being under a legal agreement or option before consideration of deliverability can go forward. They feel that's short-sighted. And again, I invite them to explain more about that if they would like to. So those are my points under little Roman numerals 1. So I invite the council initially. So presumably Mr. Brown. Welcome, Mr. Brown, to proceedings. And if there's any kind of overview you'd like to give at this stage, you're very welcome.
Thank you, sir. As with yesterday, I'm assisted today by Chris Tunnell, Andrew Marsh and Alice Henstock, and at different stages during the day they'll step into my shoes and provide answers where I can't. So just by way of overview, you've summarised the issues in relation to 3.1 little Roman 1 of your note. And I'm going to say at the outset that I think in reality, if you think about the summary you've just provided, in fact, what you've done is cover not just 3.1 Roman 1, but also Roman 2, Roman 3, and Roman 4. And one of the reasons for that is that if you look simply at your question, Roman 1 is the minimum residual requirement, reduction from 2439 to 1280, supported by the evidence. As a matter of mathematics, I don't think anybody is disputing the way in which the council has taken into account commitments that have arisen since the district plan and therefore reduced the number of sites that need to be allocated. That part of the equation, I don't understand to be challenged by anybody. If I'm wrong, I'm sure they'll put up a hand and say so in due course. In reality, the criticisms that we've received about the 1280 all pick up on points that are raised by you in your questions 2, 3, and 4. And so, for example, in relation to 2, the oversupply and the buffer that's there, we know that some people say that there shouldn't be any over provision at all. In our submission, that's simply unrealistic. It's a relatively modest over provision. 3% over the overall minimum district requirement. The maths of these things never falls out exactly in any event, but that's at a level where it's not significantly outside the district plan requirement itself. By far the greater weight of criticism, at least numerically, comes from parties who have other allocations or sites they'd like to see allocated, who are saying we should provide a much greater buffer. And so I think our starting point for that would be that if it had been necessary or a requirement to provide some sort of buffer, one would have expected to see that spelled out in the district plan itself. And as I'll come to in relation to non-implementation and reliance on strategic sites, your colleague Jonathan Bohr at the time did look at the question whether or not we should be required to provide more sites. And concluded the answer was no. And so we say at this SADPD stage, there's no need to deal with that. One of the questions you've raised is, well, what happens if the SADPD is insufficiently flexible? And our answer to that would be that you know that the review of the district plan is following closely on the heels of this document. Work started already. We expect to be submitting a copy of the district plan review in 2023, bearing in mind if there is any shortfall at all in terms of the overall plan requirement, that will not bite or begin to be felt until the end of the plan period. There is more than enough time to pick up that problem, if indeed it is a problem at that stage. I appreciate there's a separate discussion to be had about 5-year housing land supply, and we'll deal with it with that particular component at that point in the discussion today. But in terms of the overall requirement, there is no need, nothing in the district plan, and there is ample time in order to pick it up if a need should become apparent as things go on. In terms of 3, should an allowance be made for non-implementation to be built into the plan? So I think we would divide our answer into 2 parts. One of them is the smaller sites, and the other is the strategic sites. As far as the smaller sites are concerned, the answer to that question is yes, but that is exactly what we have done. We have in fact discounted the small sites by something of the order of 40%. So there is already a non-implementation buffer that is built into that, and that's all taken into account in the overall figures. As far as the strategic sites are concerned, this really comes into your question 4 about the reliance that is placed on the implementation of strategic sites. It's worth noting that the reliance on strategic sites isn't a choice that is made by the SADPD. It's effectively set by the district plan, which allocates those sites in the first place. But the way that the council has approached this, so is to say that whereas with smaller sites, which simply may not come forward, people may not seek permission at all, or if they seek permission, they may not implement that permission. With strategic sites, it's not a question of implementation. There is no doubt in the council's mind that those strategic sites will be implemented and implemented within the plan period. But that's not the question. The question, what is a realistic rate of delivery to expect from those sites over the period? And that's a matter where we've spoken to the developers, particularly close contact with Homes England in relation to Northern Arc, for example. And we have, as it were, made allowances for what may or may not happen through those discussions. And we believe that the figures that are allowed for in the 1,280 are reliable and robust in the light of those discussions. And so that's the way in which we've dealt with it. It's not that we haven't taken on board the possibility that they may not deliver as fast. Indeed, one of the things that you will note is that we have already reduced the assumptions that were previously made as to the speed with which the strategic sites would come on board, to reflect the fact that with 1 or 2 of them there has been some delay. But even with that, we're satisfied that the figures that we've now got are reliable and robust. So if I feed those things back into your question 1, is the minimum residual requirement supported by evidence? Our answer to that question is yes, sir. So that's a very quick whirlwind summary of the council's case, as set out in greater detail in the topic paper, and indeed the council's main matter statement for today. Thank you.
Thank you for that comprehensive response. I will crave your forbearance in that I will go through the Roman numerals in turn. So I will just ask, in terms of the first Roman numeral, when I can get hold of it with my mouse. And invite questions on that. And then I will, once we've had a debate on that, I'll then come back to the question of oversupply and the various other aspects. I understand they're all related. So I may be unrealistically asking for this. But who would like to contribute now? Tundra Tom. Good morning, Tundra.
Good morning, sir. Tundra Tom, on behalf of Fairfax, promoting the Clearwaters Farm site. We put in a response to Roman numeral 1, sir, and I'd like to just start with the housing commitments table. I appreciate Mr. Brown said that no one was disputing the table. We have actually acknowledged and identified a potential error which would actually be in favour of the council in terms of additions to the commitments. There are 5 entries in the table which appear to lose housing, counting to 69 dwellings. I don't know if I'm misreading the table, but you have overall numbers, overall losses, overall completions, and then total net remaining. There are 5 entries which have incorrect entries, having subtracted any losses or completions from the overall total. The Manor House at Cookfield, Horsegate House, Cookfield, Junction of Wimrell Lane, East Grinstead, Railway Approach, East Grinstead, and Carew Hall. So we would calculate that we would add 69 to the commitments. So taking that from 9,689 to 9,758. for the commitments table. So in relation to supported by evidence, the evidence would actually imply that there are additional completions or commitments for that. Moving on then to our second point, which is in relation to the Northern Arc and the build out rates. There are completions proposed for this financial year gone that ended in April, which haven't happened. So they would immediately need to be removed. And then there are also anticipated completions for this financial year, which we say are highly unlikely to happen. Now, I'll just be clear, this is not the Freaks Lane permission for 460. So for the remaining consent, there's 3,040 completions that the council are anticipating within the next 12 years. There is no reserve matters approval yet for those 3,040 that they're linked to outline consent DM 185144. The council is anticipating an extremely high build out rate for those, which is not supported by their own table. In their housing land supply statement, their average build out rate is showing as 40 on their sites. We evidenced 2 research papers which show build out rates on large sites of 2,000 or more tend to be fewer than 200 per annum. And another one that talked about sites over 1,000 having build out rates of 6.5% or 15.5 years. So 12 years and a build out rate of 8.3% or 253 dwellings per annum would seem improbable. In our reps, we have put a suggested revised trajectory in, which essentially shifts the completions on the North and Northwest Burgess Hill for the 3,040 2 years right from where the council started, which was last financial year. So looking at first completions, realistically 77 in 2022. This is still an ambitious build out rate. We would still have a build out rate of 217 per annum and 7.1%. However, if you accept this trajectory pushed 2 years to the right, plus the additional completions commitment, for that total of 9,152, we would have a residual housing requirement of 1,817 rather than the council's figure. We think that would be a more realistic. I'll leave it at that for now, so because I think that then I'm moving on to question 2. Thank you.
Just with that realistic figure, can you just give me the figure again, the last figure you gave me?
Yeah, so 1,817. So essentially what's happened is it's shifted the Northwest Burgess Hill 2 years to the right from the council's anticipated completions from last financial year, and this financial year essentially would both read naught, and it would just move the completions into next financial year. Still build out rate then 7.1%, 217 per annum, which is a bit more commensurate with build out rates in the research papers that we attached, and a residual housing requirement of 1,817 rather than 1,280. And that's all set out within our Matter 3 housing provision statement. So.
Thank you.
And I can just, sorry, just to finish then, just to show then that reserve matters for appearance, landscaping, layout and scale. The council has said in their own evidence this would be submitted this autumn. So with a fair wind, that would be approval for reserve matters 2021 December, conditions just discharged between January and March with first commencement in March, April 2022, first completions post April 22. We still think that that is an ambitious timetable, but a far more realistic one than was submitted by the council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got Chris Huff next.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Chris Huff, Sigma Planning on behalf of Ryden Homes. I just really through you, so I was asking for some information from the council. We've got an outstanding, a reduction, shall I say, or reducing outstanding requirement from the district plan. That reduction is in basically in two parts. One is completions. The other element is further commitments. Now, those further commitments can only have come from neighbourhood plans. And I was having some difficulty trying to sort out the proportions between new commitments and completions that have led to the reduction. I may have missed it somewhere, if so please tell me where it is, but I just thought it would be helpful to you to understand where those are coming from, whether they are actual completions or whether they are commitments within neighbourhood plans. And as I said yesterday, we're now dealing with the third stage, the mopping up operation, which is the last opportunity to actually provide the sites to deliver the housing over the planned period. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We'll put that to the council in due course. Judith Ashton.
Good morning, sir. Judith Ashton on behalf of Waits Developments, and in particular their interests at Crawley Down. As you mentioned in my statement, I start with a table that just compares the situation as it was in the district plan and as it now is in the site allocations plan. I then return to that at the end of my evidence, just to indicate how I see the position as it has evolved, given the concerns that we have expressed. I find myself kind of agreeing with Mr. Brown at this stage that actually, in order to answer your Roman numeral 1, you have to deal with Roman numerals 2, 3 and 4 because they are intrinsically interlinked.
Fine, in that case, go ahead.
Well, I wasn't going to. I'm going to try and keep myself to the single point one, but I mean, basically the situation is that when you look at the site allocations DPD, the main difference is between the commitments and the windfalls. This then leads to questions about how realistic the commitment figures are, queries about non-implementation rates, and in particular the issue of the delivery of the strategic allocations, which Tandra Tong has already commented on, and I know others have in their statements as well, and we can go on to talk about later. And it also raises issues with 5-year housing land supply. We, within our statement, have questioned the extent to which there is sufficient evidence before you to demonstrate that what is being suggested by the District Council is supported by the evidence. And we have, at the end of our statement, actually set out what we believe the situation to be, having regard to our comments on both the need for a non-implementation rate on the existing commitments, and in also our view on the windfall position, which actually means we come up with a residual requirement for 3,608 dwellings, which is 1,844 above that which is currently being proposed within the site allocations plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Is there anybody else who wants to speak on Romans 1? Lucy Wilford.
Good morning, it's Lucy Wilford from Baltimore, representing retirement villages. I did hear your point on openings about the qualitative housing being assessed later on. We have made comments against these matters, but we'll defer them to later. It was just to make a simple point, and it picks up a matter that was made by the council yesterday regarding DP4 and the suggestion there is no requirement to allocate or address the need for specialist accommodation. The housing requirement in DP4 does cover both C3 housing and C2. The council makes that point in its topic paper 4 at paragraph 1.12. So it is a consideration for housing numbers as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Wilford. Anybody else on Roman 1? Councillor Ian Gibson, good morning to you. Welcome to our
Morning,
proceedings.
sir. Can you see me? Yes,
I
think
can
we
see you clear.
I think the listening to this, I listened to the proceedings yesterday as well. I think there's just one minor observation, which is really having followed this process over something like 8 years. This is a moving target you're talking about, sir. And I think you have to consider the point at which you draw the line and say, this is the number of houses which we are trying to achieve. This is the residual requirement. And I just have a concern that as this process drifts on, and I think we've looked at the figures in 2017, 2018, 2019, that you'll find that at the end of this, that you've coming out with a figure which should be lower than the figures which you're being advised of. I sit on 2 parish councils. I see the various applications coming through, and I can assure you that there's a steady flow of new sites being added throughout the period. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I just wonder if anybody wants to either agree or comment or even disagree with what Councillor Gibson has just said about the figure should be lower because there's a steady flow coming through all the time. Are we in danger of over-egging the cake? He didn't mention that phrase, I did. Does anybody want to come back on that? Judith Ashton.
I thought you had a plethora of hands, sir. If actually you look at the housing trajectory in the district plan at Appendix A, and you look at the housing trajectory in document H2, the housing land supply statement, you will actually see, sir, that delivery rates relative to expectations have not been as high as were anticipated. And while sites may still be coming through, we are talking here about ensuring that the plan provides for the minimum requirement and provides for a rolling 5-year housing land supply. They are both important points to have consideration to. And whilst there might be the odd site coming through, a number of those are either allocated sites or they are sites actually that went through the appeal process a few years ago because of the situation with the 5-year housing land supply at that time. And I think all of us don't want to be in that situation again. We would much prefer to see allocated sites being made so that we all know where we are and we can move forward accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Andrea Black. Do take the floor.
Good morning, sir. Yeah, just following on from Judith Ashton there. Just in terms of delivery, whilst I respect the point that the councillor made, one thing that hasn't been discussed so far at these proceedings is the housing delivery test figures for the authority, and released in January 2021 showed that Mid Sussex produced 91% of its targets for the previous 3 years. That was effectively a delivery of 2,270 against a target of 2,490. Now, one of the things within that, and as you're well aware, is that takes the previous 3 years delivery. And Mid Sussex have been pretty consistent actually in terms of their delivery. So the previous 3 years were 812, 876 and 802 in each of those previous monitoring years. But the issue that you have is that the target obviously within 2019 to 2020 jumped from around the 600 mark to 1,005. So that's where it's dipped effectively last year. Now, of course, what will happen is that in the next monitoring year, that target will remain. Well, in fact, it will go up because there will need to be a buffer applied. So what we're potentially seeing within Mid Sussex, as a number of other authorities, they're certainly not alone in this by any stretch, but you have a kind of erosion of the 5-year, effectively the housing delivery test result. So there's a high likelihood, and I can't say I've got my crystal ball out and can say exactly what it is, but there is a high likelihood that 91% will be significantly lower when the next housing delivery test results come through, notwithstanding what's happened in terms of delivery in the last year. And that is a matter that's simply here to stay with government policy and significantly boosting the supply of housing. And effectively, we're working within a scenario where the government have set out their stall very clearly within the NPPF to say, look, it is about what's going forward. It is about a housing land supply. It is about 5 years. It's about delivery, but it's also about looking back. And it's also about looking at what's being delivered. And I think that's something that I just wanted to put a marker down, with the utmost respect to the council that made those comments. But that's just a further bit of context, which I hope is helpful.
Thank you. Any more comments on Romans 1, or I'm going to move on to Romans 2, which, as I've been reminded by a number of you, is very closely related. So just coming through onto Romans 2. Again, we're talking now about the oversupply, the buffer of 484 dwellings, and whether, I've got Ashley Bauer. Was that in connection with Romans 1?
It was 2. I was just very excited to get on to 2. So.
Right, I'll let you in first. Let me just go through and summarise what people have said, and then you'll be right in. So the council have said that the balance, the buffer balances considerations such as delivery experience, reliance on commitments, the balance of large and smaller sites, and that the oversupply of 484 dwellings provides sufficient flexibility and fully accounts for known delivery issues have arisen since the district plan was adopted. Pegasus Group state that it's insufficient, that it's especially true that where there is a reliance on a few strategic sites, in this situation, 4 sites to deliver 5,800 dwellings, it's commonplace, so not just a Mid-Sussex thing by any means, for delivery of such sites to be delayed beyond timescales allowed for in plans. Nexus planning state that it's an insufficient barrier to give the plan sufficient flexibility, and that the buffer must be assessed against the entire housing requirement yet to be delivered. And to be fair, the council are accepting that. It's not a problem with the council as far as I can see. Bolton Wilmore, again, the point about specialist accommodation, which we'll park for the time being. Turley for A2 Dominion, that they're concerned that the evidence isn't there as to how the trajectory is being calculated. They also point me to the value, the viability point that we talked about yesterday. They put a little bit more flesh on the bones by, in fact, indicating a number of sites which account for 240 dwellings, which are stated in the viability report, document IV2, in fact, or 1V2. Those sites are of concern as not coming forward, potentially. Judith Ashton Associates, they do not believe the suggested buffer of 484 is a sufficient borough to allow enough flexibility. DMH Stallard just point out that the policy DP4 is a minimum policy, should be flexibility. Savills for Charterhouse strategic land, that it's important to bear in mind the increased required DPA up from 1,090 in 2024-5 in relation to the current 876 DPA. So in their words, the pertinent move is to build an appropriate barrier which provides greater flexibility for delivery. Litchfields, that being 2.95% over the whole requirement for the district is far too low, and that if you in fact, reduce that figure. They feel that in fact even that's got problems. You could be down to 1.52%, down from 2.95. Denton Homes, the barrier of 484 is insufficient to enable the delivery of housing over the planned period. There should be less reliance on windfalls and on strategic sites in their view. Andrew Black, the oversupply is required for the plan to be sound. Significant concerns around the reliance of large strategic sites and lack of details in the trajectory. A lot of you are saying that. And buffer of 484 dwellings may actually be insufficient to enable the required delivery of housing over the planned period. Right, those are the comments I just summarised. Dr. Ashley Bowes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. May I bring in Mr. Grace, who doesn't have a hand raising function?
Yes, sure.
And we're both, just for your note, as you'll recall from yesterday, we're both the Burgess Hill Town Council and So Flag. Thank
Yes.
you.
Good morning, sir. In short, we believe that the buffer level actually exceeds the level required to specifically meet the district plan level. We clearly believe that a figure of 144 is large enough to be consistent with the district plan in what is a strong housing market area. We heard in yesterday's openings from the council that the local planning authority consider that a range of sites have been identified, both within the district plan and this DPD. No slippage, we were told yesterday by the local planning authority is expected on district plan sites, which is good news when considering this development plan document. It fully supports the view that a lower, circa 10% buffer is actually entirely consistent with the district plan. A recent appeal case identifies a housing supply level of more than 5 years. The district plan would have been considered with some slippage within the district plan, and this has already been assessed by a planning inspector. There is simply no residual need for more housing to be specifically allocated in Burgess Hill on what are unspoiled and special greenfield gaps that critically separate the town with the South Downs National Park boundary. We say that Burgess Hill has already had large allocations for new housing to the north and the east of the town. And again, simply put, this daughter plan of the district plan sets out on page 37 and 38 that Burgess Hill has already identified sufficient commitments and completions to meet their minimum housing requirement for the full plan period. I am sure, sir, that this daughter's mother and father did not seek to allocate development on an area that was felt to be important to protect, and we may say critical to protect, for not only current residents, but also future generations. We shall say much more in the matters under 3.2, but in conclusion with this specific point, with a 10% buffer, this will allow enough flexibility in the delivery of housing over the plan period. Thank you, sir.
Before you go, thank you for that. The 10% buffer, if I can understand what you mean by that, is that 10% over the residual or 10% over the plan as a whole?
Of the residual, sir.
Right. After that, I'll take Judith Ashton next.
Hello again, sir. As we've said in our statement, we don't believe the 484 is sufficient buffer. Indeed, we think it might be insufficient to actually meet the minimum requirements over the plan period. It is 2.95% of the district requirement, as you've identified in your question. And we believe that the buffer should be circa 10% of the outstanding requirement. I know some are saying that it should be the entire district plan requirement, but in reality, we feel that probably 10% of the outstanding requirement at 1,147 would be around about the right figure. That would then ensure flexibility within the housing figures to ensure that the minimum requirement is met over the plan period, and also enable the local authority to ensure that they have a rolling 5-year housing land supply.
Thank you. David Murray Cox.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, Mr. Murray Cox.
Struggling with the IT. David Murray Cox from Turley on behalf of A2 Dominion. Just for your information, I will speak later on with a different hat on when I appear for Rainier Developments on the specialist accommodation issue. We agree with the comments made by other participants that the buffer is insufficient. And the first point that we note arises from the council's document H2, which shows there's already an accrued shortfall. So that then aligns with the comments made by others regarding the housing delivery test, for example. The point to note, of course, is that later in the plan period, the annual requirement increases, but H2 also shows you that at that point delivery rate doesn't reach those levels either. As you've identified, the council relies significantly on a number of strategic sites. And the council's own evidence shows that some of those sites, some of the proposed allocations in the plan are not viable. Those make a meaningful contribution even to the buffer as envisaged by the council now. The council's document MSDC 01, which I think was their response to your initial questions, does provide a trajectory for the 4 sites, I think, which is DP 9 onwards, but does not explain how that's been informed and the assumptions that have been taken into account. And that evidence, even that presented for those 4 sites, is not available for the other sources of supply. Moreover, as far as I can see, there's no analysis as to the relationship between delivery rates and infrastructure delivery. Another worrying concern is that the housing trajectory supporting this document seems to suggest that for a number of years, the delivery rates are exactly the same as for other years, which rather makes our point that the housing trajectory hasn't been informed by evidence. The reality is that if you remove less than 500 dwellings from the supply, then the overall minimum requirement is not achieved. And it's important to note that the requirement is expressed wherever you look as a minimum figure. It must therefore be exceeded in order for the requirements of DP4 to be met. There could be any number of reasons why sites do not deliver as expected, for example, reduced capacity due to design or other constraints or delay. An example of how delay can cause real problems actually arises from the council's 5-year supply assessment from 2017, when the council expected 605 dwellings to be completed in the next 5-year period from the North and West Burgess Hill allocation. But as far as I can see, and we say in our statement, we're really a significant way from that at all. There are various buffers, as just been referred to in the submissions, including the council's matter statement. But the reality is that there's only one that matters, and that's the achievement of the overall minimum requirement. You heard the suggestion that if there had been a need for a buffer, then that would have been addressed by your colleague, Mr. Bohr, in the district plan. We say that's the wrong way of looking at this. The district plan sets the minimum requirement. It identifies strategic allocations to help get there. And this site allocations DPD is partly concerned with allocating sites. But what it's got to do is to ensure the framework, when you put all of this together, is sufficient and sufficiently flexible, plus sufficiently aspirational to get there. And just a few final points. So the question we pose is that when you put all of this together, including the lack of evidence on delivery rates for the sites generally, but also for the 4 strategic sites, and the concerns that you've heard from others about delivery rates of large sites and the evidence which is repeated at examinations up and down the country now, the evidence on existing completions is a buffer of 284, which includes a supply of more than 200 on sites which is shown by the council's evidence to not be viable, sufficiently flexible and aspirational to get there. We say that it's not, and in particular it fails to provide that degree of flexibility. DP4 is not about getting close to the requirement, it's not about meeting it, but it's about exceeding it, and this document is the correct vehicle to do so. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray Cox. Chris Huff.
Thank you, sir. Yes, 484 isn't enough. In terms of the performance to date, the average annual completion rate has been 819 per annum, 819, against a requirement of 964 per annum. That's 15% underperformance. And that's reflected in the figures that Andrew Black gave us for the housing delivery test. In terms of the large sites, we've heard about Northern Arc underperforming. On the council's figures, they were expecting by now 3,500. They've actually got 2,787. That's a 20% underperformance. Now, the council say that they're confident that they will be able to deliver everything they say, but they were confident back in the district plan situation. And despite Paul Brown's self-congratulations and the comments from Councillor Gibson, the monitoring is showing that they're falling short. Now, 484, I work out, is a 4.2% buffer on the remaining balance. It's 3% or just under of the total. Generally, it has to be an arbitrary figure, and 10% is a standard approach to give flexibility. To achieve that, we need more sites. And without that, so the plan would not be positively prepared, effective, or consistent with national policy to boost housing supply. The question you asked, sir, is of us earlier on was, could we suggest what you should do about that? The first point I have on that, sir, is you shouldn't leave it to the review. There has, with various inspectors at examination in the past, been a sort of overriding indication that the plan should be found sound because it's bad not having a plan. I go along with that, and certainly I'm in the camp of saying we don't want this plan to be found unsound. But something has to be done. Now, Inspector Bohr previously faced the same issue. He adopted a stepped trajectory to address it, but he at that time had the prospect of this plan and the neighbourhood plans dealing with any shortfall. So he was in a much more comfortable position. But generally, the government's requiring a harder line now, and I'm sure you're familiar with the recent inspectors' conclusions on Sevenoaks, Tonbridge and Morling and Tandridge. And there, they haven't felt that they should leave it to a further review. So I reject Paul Brown's suggestion that if there was a problem, you should leave it to review. It should be done now. What I would suggest, without impinging upon you, it is only a suggestion, is that if you came up with an interim conclusion that more sites were required, and I would say that that should be not large strategic sites because we need deliverable sites, then the council could quite easily find a number of sites. There's quite a few participants here who are trying to promote sites, me included. And so there's a ready pool there for them to revisit very quickly. They've all been assessed. And in fact, they did it before, because in the middle of the district plan examination last time, new sites appeared, particularly a very large one, 500 odd units at Hassocks, which came out of the blue. So that is something that can be done. And why does it need to be done? I think the main reason, Sarah, are the underperformance that I've referred to. We are talking about minimum figures, so over provision is better than under provision. We've still got ongoing slow delivery from the strategic allocations. The windfall allowance increase is really somewhat contrived. It's not new sites, it's just a recalculation based on different criteria, size of sites. And we still got a very strong and ongoing need in the adjoining districts at Brighton, Crawley, Tandridge, and the other areas I've mentioned. So we do need the flexibility, and I would agree with Judith Ashton on that, that a 10% is the minimum figure you should be looking at, which would be a 1,150 buffer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. I'll take Oliver Ball next from Nexus.
Thank you, sir. Oliver Bell from Nexus Planning on behalf of Miller Homes. I think most of my points have been covered by others. I think just to reiterate, we support the view that, I think to be fair to the council, that it'd be appropriate to measure the buffer against the residual requirement post completions, and that based on the council's H2 note would be 11,473. So a buffer measured against that at the moment is only 4.2%, and we heard this morning that the council themselves accepted that that is only modest. And I think if you put that into context, if you look just over simplistically over the next 10 years, we only need sort of approximately 48 dwellings to fall out of the supply figures each year for it to fail to meet even the minimum district housing requirement. So it's not much slippage that is necessary for the plan to fail to deliver on its principal requirements set out within the district plan. And no doubt we'll come on to this later, but obviously we've already heard in that context about the significant reliance upon strategic sites. And I think the council, in their response to your initial questions, they're suggesting that there's some almost 4,200 dwellings that can be delivered by strategic sites over the remaining plan period. And what that does is it's increasing the reliance upon strategic sites for supply in the remainder of the plan period. It's now going to be increasing up to, I think it's 36.4% of the remaining supply, which I suppose brings into question as to whether that buffer is sufficient because of, as the comments have already been made in terms of the uncertainties over the delivery rates associated with a number of strategic sites, in particular the Northern Arc. So in light of that, we support the comments that Judith Ashton's made in terms of a buffer of at least 10%. That's set out in our matter free statement. And I also just comment that I think it is absolutely right that the site allocations plan should be considering a buffer at this stage, regardless of whether or not there's no direction within the district plan to do that. The role of the site allocations plan was always there to identify sufficient sites to meet that minimum requirement, and a judgment as to how many dwellings would be required to do that can only be made at this stage once an assessment has been carried out as to the performance of the district plan to date. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan Buckwell. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. So Jonathan Buckwell, DHA Planning on behalf of Option 2 Development. I won't repeat a lot of the points which I agree with that others have made, but we do take particular issue, I think, with the council's reasoning at paragraph 117 of their response to this question as to why additional sites can't be allocated. I mean, firstly, they say they have confidence in the trajectory, and we certainly agree with others that they are being overconfident here and there's not enough flexibility in the plan. Secondly, we certainly agree the 484 oversupply isn't enough, and I won't repeat what others have said. The main point that I'd like to make is in relation to their third bullet point, where they're suggesting that they can't go find alternative sites on the basis that clear and robust justification has already been given for rejecting alternative sites, which therefore makes it difficult to allocate further sites in the DPD at this stage, as they say. Well, this just is not a good enough reason at all. We all know there are advantages and disadvantages of any candidate site. It all comes down to balance. A site can be rejected in one review, but be found to be a perfectly acceptable option next time around. Otherwise, there would never be new sites available in new local plans, would there? So I think an assessment that shows that all sites are either acceptable or not in some binary way is a gross oversimplification. It's quite clear that there are plenty of perfectly acceptable, sustainable sites which are suitable for allocation, including my client's own land at Copthorne. This just is not a good enough answer to that question. Thank you.
Dr. Ashley Bowes again.
Yeah, very short points. Just in response to what Mr. Hoff told you about the Sevenoaks and Tonbridge local plan. So I had the pleasure of being involved with the Tonbridge local plan, and Sevenoaks is the adjoining authority. Regrettably, neither of those plans proceeded to an inspector expressing a view about the merit of a review or otherwise, because both were found to have failed the duty to cooperate at an interim stage, and that was the basis of the inspector's interim correspondence. So that there wasn't a finding in either plan from the inspectors about the merit of an early review. Thank you.
You're certainly right about the duty to cooperate failure on that. If it helps anybody, but we've got beyond that hurdle on this plan. Right, anybody else who wants to talk about little 2? Otherwise, I'll go on to 3, which is, again, I accept going over some of the same points, but we may get some new comments that will help me, which is, should an allowance be made for non-implementation? And the council's view, which has already been stated by Paul Brown, is that a rate of 40% is applied to small sites, and that large sites are monitored on a site-by-site basis, and that they would say there is not the evidence to warrant an arbitrary 10% non-implementation allowance. Other people like DHA would support a 10% figure, and Nexus, Turley state that it's reasonable to assume that not all sites will be implemented, and therefore an allowance needs to be built in. Judith Ashton Associates, yes, there should be a 10% allowance for non-delivery. Savills, again, 10% seems appropriate. Litchfield, a more positive and effective way of providing flexibility would be to simply allocate more sites, sufficient to provide at least a 10% borough, 10% exceedance there, or buffer. Denton Homes, at least 10% should be allowed for non-implementation. Andrew Black making the points about non-implementation rates being applied to other plans recently, and he quotes Epping Forest and 10% and 5% to Maidstone. So I've got Chris Huff back on that. Chris Huff, do come in.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I was just going back to the previous topic just briefly to come back on that point from Dr. Brown. I think my point wasn't quite understood on Sevenoaks and Tonbridge and Malling. The point I was making is that a harder line is being taken with plans. In that case, yes, it was duty to cooperate, but the fundamental point there was about housing provision, and a different approach could have been adopted by those inspectors of proceeding with an examination, and then if the figures weren't enough, then proceed to a review. Obviously, I think most of, certainly the professionals here, know exactly what was happening at Sevenoaks and Tonbridge and Morling. The point is about that I was making was that inspectors did have a tendency to override issues to some extent on the basis of the prospect of them being able to be dealt with at a review in the future. And I have identified a harder line coming from the inspectors on those points. That's and from the Secretary of State, who may be behind it or may not be. That was the only point I was making. Thank you, sir.
What you say. Right, Judith Ashton.
Thank you again, sir. First and foremost, I agreed with Mr. Huff's previous set of comments in terms of the situation with the district plan and the situation that arose at the time where Inspector Bohr felt that there was a need for further allocations, and notwithstanding the district council's position that there weren't any suitable sites, they then went away and found one, and that was duly allocated. And I think, sir, actually it's quite interesting if you refer to Inspector Bohr's final report and paragraph 37 of that in particular, where he references the fact that it is very important that the plan has resilience should, for example, one of the sites take longer to start or is slower to deliver. And he then goes on to refer to the forthcoming site allocations DPD, the need to ensure not only 5-year housing land supply exists at present, but there's a rolling 5-year supply that is maintained in the future. And he talks about the need to basically, for want of a better phrase, future-proof the plan itself to ensure that the whole housing requirement is delivered within the plan period. I think his comments are quite telling. And I think also the fact that Mid Sussex suggests there aren't other sites available is somewhat of a misnomer. It's clear from the SHELAR that there are a number of sites out there. There are a number of us here promoting sites. And I'm sure, sir, if you were to give an interim finding suggesting that further sites needed to be found to provide a further buffer, then the District Council would be in a position to find them. Thank you.
Right, are there any more comments on My Little Romans 3? In which case I will go to the final one of these four, which were grouped together by Paul Brown. So I'm catching up with him now. And in little 4, I'm asking about the strategic sites that we've been talking about, that the council places a high reliance on them. Nothing wrong in that in itself. That these sites are expected to deliver a total of 5,800 dwellings, or 35.4% of the minimum district requirement. That's of the 16,390 dwellings. Obviously, that figure can be changed in terms of time. And the question is this total realistically deliverable within the planned period? And if not, does the council need to allocate further additional housing sites? The council's view is that significant progress is being made in the delivery of strategic sites, including the Northern Arm and Northern Arc, and that's acquired by Homes England, as we know, as a flagship scheme. So they feel that that gives even more credence to their view. That there has been some delay, but that's been accounted for by a revised residual requirement now down to 1,280, with flexibility provided for by oversupply of 484 homes. So they feel, therefore, there's no additional housing requirements required. I think in the minute it'll be interesting just to look at the tables that are in document MSDC 01, which is the council's response to the inspector's initial questions in my document ID 01 under section 3, reliance on strategic housing sites. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I'll just go through what other people have said about strategic sites. DHA planning The shortfall of delivery compared with the trajectory points to it being in excess of the 484 dwellings oversupply. So therefore a significant risk that not enough dwellings will be delivered during the planned period. Nexus, quote, the start to finish report, which I have a copy of, which basically states that large sites of over 2,000 dwellings delivery, you're getting about 160 dwellings per annum. But the council is assuming higher rates of over 200 to 300 for 9 out of the next 9 of the last 10 years of the planned period. Therefore, Nexus saying the reliance is too high, not supported by the data. Barton Williams, again about extra care, which will park for the time being. Turley, the 4 strategic sites are now expected to deliver 4,427 dwellings, 36.4%, as we've heard them say, of all dwellings to be delivered. This justifies additional allocations, and we give a number of reasons for that. They state that there's no indication as how the trajectory has been calculated. There's no trajectory for other sources of supply, i.e. other than the 4 strategic sites. That there are minor changes in site capacity which could have a dramatic consequence on the figures, and that there's the unmet need from neighbouring authorities that we've also heard about. Judith Ashton goes through some of those strategic sites, questions the delivery rate east of Pease Pottage, even with two outlets. She feels that 187 dwellings per annum and 158 over 2020-21 to 2021-22. They would question that. And on the Clayton Mills, that's DP 11, that the revised matters application is not due to be submitted till June at the earliest this month, and therefore questions the completions figures given there. And that's the northwest of Burgess Hill with the Northern Arc. She states the phasing totals seem to have changed since the Northern Arc delivery plan was approved by a council cabinet meeting in September 2018. Delivery now seems to be 20% less than predicted in the district plan. And the report I just mentioned by Litchfield, the which I'm struggling to find what that was, but it's a report, basically this Litchfield's report on the average time taken. I'm talking about sites of 2,000 plus, that from validation to first completion is 8.4 years. And that again makes the figures, the council's figures, questioned. Savills, that the SA identifies, and we've mentioned that point already, that 713 and 3,500 council already accepted is not going to happen in the planned period. Litchfields, with the exception of site DP8, there has been a delay in bringing forward these larger strategic sites, and they only need to be delayed a little bit more, and there are going to be serious problems. Denton Homes, again, too much reliance on those sites. Andrew Black, again, highly reliant on the delivery of these larger sites, and concern for the lead-in time being ambitious. So basically we have virtually all the developers who've contributed to this examination all expressing a degree of concern that the biggest elements in the housing figures for the council are not going to come forward in the numbers required, and that therefore a figure of 484 is far too small, and that what is needed is some additional sites. I've been invited by a number of respondents to come out with an interim finding. As I said right at the outset in my introduction, I do this on about 50% of plans anyway, so it's something I'm considering. I'll obviously bide my time until I've heard what everybody has to say today, but that's been put to me. So are there any more comments that anybody wishes to make on this is a Romans 4 about the implementation of strategic sites? Andrew Black.
Thank you, sir. So one of the things that we took you to in our matters statement was the council's latest 5-year housing land supply statement. Now, I couldn't see that this is currently in front of you as an evidence-based document. It may be, and if I'm wrong about that, I apologise, but that sets out a number of...
December of last year, December 2020.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, I have that.
You've got that.
Yep.
So within that, the council has set out in Appendix 1 of that document, these lead-in times and the lead-in times reports on this. And that sets out sites of 100 units or more. And there's a number of columns within that. And maybe this is something you may want to seek clarification from the council on, because I think there may be an error in this in terms of the maths. Because what they've done is they've set out in a number of columns time between application received and permission. And then the next column along, there's time between outline decision and detailed permission. And the council is saying that the average lead-in time on sites of 100 units or more for time between outline decision and detailed permission is 0.5 of a year or 6 months. Now, one of the things I think that they've got wrong here is where you have a detailed application straight off, that column has a 0 in it. So in terms of the average, those zeros have gone in to skew the average down. So you have an average of 0.5 years or 6 months, but that's taking into account that some of those didn't need to go from outline to detailed. And actually, if you take those out, take the zeros out and redo the maths, it's not 0.5 years, it's 1.76 years or 21 months. So I wonder if that is skewing some of the analysis and some of the basis on which the council are saying things are going to come forward. Is that
not the case where you've got an application that's in fact gone straight into a full application and bypassed the stage of outline?
Yes. But
therefore 0 between the two.
Yeah, but they're making analysis on applications going from outline to detailed and effectively saying that there's a period of 0.5 years. Well, it's not 0.5 years, it's longer. Because they're using
council's response to that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. The other element of that document, which I looked at in detail, was if you go then to Appendix 3 of that document, and that sets out 5-year supply sites and delivery rates and delivery by year, and it goes into a number of different areas. And at the bottom of that, there's B list sites, and you've got effectively analysis of the major sites with outline planning permission. And what you have, sorry, I skipped forward a bit there, you have a number of sites in terms of delivery already, and the average, that shows an average build out rate of sites for 100 units or more is 40 per year. That's in Appendix 2, sir. Sorry, I've skipped ahead a bit there. Appendix 2 has the build out rates for sites of 100 units. And that shows an average of 40 per year. And even if you take the outliers there, the most you have is 76, something like that, 80 from those. And then putting that into Appendix 3, which is the major sites, and looking at particularly Burgess Hill, the phase 1 of the Northern Arc. And this is where I have concern, and I know others have concern here, that even despite what that evidence has said, and I acknowledge what others will probably take you to in terms of the findings of Litchfield's report, which I commend, the council is anticipating delivery of 135 dwellings, 157 dwellings, and 257 dwellings in 2022, 23, and the next 3 years after that. And that just simply doesn't tally up with what the average is setting out in terms of what's being delivered elsewhere. And that's a significant concern of mine, sir, and I know it is of others. And I think that's something that really requires much further scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I'll take Tundra Tom and then we'll break for coffee. Tundra Tom.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I think I maybe went early on my analysis of the Northern Arc, because I spoke about this in answer to question 1, but Mr. Black was drawing on exactly the same evidence that I was alluding to there in terms of the council's housing statement and their average build outs of 40 per annum. The table 1 in our representation splits out the Freaks Lane 460 from that remaining, which is currently at outline stage of 3,040. Essentially, in Mid Sussex's response to your initial questions, they have 209 completions anticipated by 31st of March 2022 on a 3,000 outline permission. So with the reserve matters anticipated for September this year, that doesn't meet their own lead-in times analysis, and those build-out rates to have 209 completions but by March is just not realistic. And you know, thank you to Mr. Black again for going over and highlighting those specific appendices in the housing land supply statement, because that's what had informed our research, and the housing trajectory that we propose just shoves everything 2 years to allow a proper timeline lead in, and then slightly revised build out rates, which we said we're still ambitious. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we'll take a break and we'll come back at 20 past 11. Thank you. Hi. Right, I think I'm back on again. Am I good to go, Charlotte?
Yep.
Okay, session is resumed. The report I got tongue-tied on, of course, is the start to finish report by Litchfields, which a number of you have quoted, and obviously I've read that as well. I've got Judith Ashton wishing to speak. Is it on continuation of Romans numeral 4, Judith?
It is, sir, but it will be quite a short point, and I'm saying it in order to try and assist if I can.
Yeah, carry on in that case.
Okay, and I apologise for the background noise, but my neighbour's just decided to start mowing his lawn, so I can hardly hear myself think. Basically, the situation as we see it is that, in particular with Burgess Hill, there are various different documents that are providing you with different information, and in some instances, conflicting information. And I think it would possibly help you and this examination if Mid Sussex could actually provide statements of common ground with all of those promoting the 4 strategic sites that are mentioned in Roman numeral 4, so that you can get clarity from them in terms of what their planning programme is, what their anticipated start dates are, what their anticipated delivery rates are, how many outlets they anticipate having, and therefore what kind of completion dates you are looking at, and whether they will be able to deliver what is expected of them over the plan period, in particular Burgess Hill, given the quantum of housing related to that site. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. What I was just going to say, starting this session off, was a point I alluded to before the break, looking at the tables of the strategic sites, which are in document MSDC01, and they're on pages 17 through to 20. And I was going to invite the council initially if they wanted to state to me that they either stood by those tables or whether there were any changes to them that they wanted me to notice. But I also will put to them Judith Ashton's suggestion as well of a statement of common ground that any party that wished to could contribute to, in the way of just getting some sort of clarity of what the council and others are saying. So with that in mind, is there anybody who wishes to comment on those 4 tables of the strategic sites?
So I have a general point on the Peas Pottage site.
Right. I do beg your pardon, my fault. I was also going to say that if we could postpone the 5-year housing land comments that Andrew Black made for the council to consider until we get to matter 3.4. So I've not forgotten those comments, Andrew. I just parked them. Right. Okay. Do carry on, Mr. Cox.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. So this may well be something that could be picked up through a note of clarification from the local authority, but the Peas Pottage site, policy DP10 in the district plan, allocated for approximately 600 new homes. In document MSDC01, this is on page 18 of that document, you get the assumptions of the district plan at 600 dwellings during the course of the plan period. You then get a figure in the row below that for actual delivery of 41 in the year 2019-20, and then you get in the bottom row the updated forecast completions as of March 21, which says 619. So you add those 2 figures together and you get 660. And what I'm really struggling with is finding the basis for that site delivering 660 dwellings during the plan period, bearing in mind the various permissions referred to in the table below. For example, the first of those, permission from 2016, outline permission for 619 units. And the same issue arises when you look at the housing land supply completion table, which I don't have the document number in front of me now, but on that there's various sites listed, and it's a single page document. For Peas Pottage, these 3 sites are identified towards the bottom. 3 sites which make up this allocation. And when you add the contribution of all of those together, you don't get to the figures in MSDC01 either. The effect and issue of that is, if my maths is right, then you take out 41 units and you assume that it delivers 619 dwellings by the end of the plan period. That's 10% of the buffer that we were talking about before the break. So that was the simple point. I have nothing else to add.
Thank you. Any more comments on the table from anybody, or the tables? Is everybody else in the room, the Zoom room, happy with those tables then? Oliver Bell. Floor is yours.
Sorry, sir. Just unmuting myself. Just to come back, just in terms of just reiterating that, in terms of asking whether we're happy. We've of course outlined in our response to your question here in respect of Burgess Hill, questioning the delivery rates and whether or not they are realistic. They are very high, and that's consistent throughout the plan period. We've obviously already seen a substantial slippage in the delivery. I appreciate that Homes England have now taken on the site and that the council consider that this gives them a greater confidence on delivery, but we're still awaiting a reserve matters application for the overwhelming majority of the site, which is yet to be submitted. And even being a reserve matters application, that's not going to be straightforward, and probably means that completions are going to be not immediately commencing from sort of 2022 monitoring period onwards. So I think there's already a distinct prospect of slippage there, even based on the current programme. So I would agree with you, Ashton, that some form of statement of common ground, an updated position would be useful. And I think that it's probably, even based on the council's figures now, it's going to show erosion of that limited buffer that the council put in place, which I think just only serves to support the case that a number of parties have been making, but the buffer should be increased to account for the fact that there is a substantial reliance generally on strategic sites. And it's not to say that we're not expecting them to come forward at all, but there is a distinct prospect that they are going to, there will be slippage in the delivery. This site allocation plan has come forward and been able to rectify the slippage, or tries to rectify the slippage, which has happened with Burgess Hill. But we don't have the evidence in front of us to give us the confidence that that's not going to happen again on other strategic sites. And what is a mechanism to rectify that? At present, we have a very modest buffer, which in our view is insufficient.
Thank you for that. Black.
Thank you, sir. It's just following on from what Miss Ashton was saying in terms of the statements of common ground. What would be helpful? It's very difficult when you look at these tables. You've got the delivery trajectory, but of course, many of these sites comprise of multiple phases. Some are phases which already have planning and are under construction. Just in the instance of DP8, the east of Burgess Hill, you've got phase 4 that's pending a decision. So what we really need to do, if we're going to be able to scrutinise these, what we then need to see is that delivery split into the different phases to understand what the council is saying in terms of delivery from existing kind of effectively committed sites that already have the planning in place, and then the future phases, so we can properly scrutinise what are they saying in terms of delivery from each phase. I just wanted to put some marker down on that, sir.
Thank you. Any further comments on this table before I invite the council to come in? Right, I can't hold this up indefinitely. I'll give it an opportunity there. I wonder if I could talk to either Mr. Brown or Andrew on this one.
So,
Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Sir, I'm going to adopt the same approach I did yesterday, which is I'll start off with some overarching points, and then we'll go down to Mr. Marsh and then Ms. Henstock for some detail. And as we go.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to try and keep my response within the ambit of your question 3.1. I think, as you yourself have noted, some of the comments that we've had have strayed into 3.4 on 5-year housing land supply. We've also strayed into 3.6 should the council be or you be directed to find more sites at this stage. I might just briefly pick up on 3.6 in response. So if I start with 3.1 Roman 1, you will remember when I opened this morning, I said that it didn't appear to the council that anybody was actually attacking the mathematics of the 1280. That most of the criticisms related to what are your Roman points 2, 3, and 4. So having heard the comments this morning, I think with one exception, that has been borne out. The one exception is Tondra Tom's helpful contribution that if anything, she believes that we've missed out 69 completions. So the residual requirement would, if anything, be lower than 1280, would take it down presumably on that basis to 1211. I'll leave it to Mr. Marsh and Ms. Henstock if they want to come back on that, but to the extent that there is a criticism, there is one that is helpful to us rather than unhelpful, and it may well be that we simply leave that there. Mr. Huff, in his comments, it wasn't so much a criticism as a question about where the commitments have come from in relation to completions. So you'll understand that the difference between completions and commitments, in response to Mr. Huff's point, it's just worth stressing now. Commitments, new commitments, do not arise simply by virtue of new allocations in neighbourhood plans. They also arise out of planning permissions that have been granted since the district plan on sites which were not allocated in the district plan. And in fact, that is where most of the additional commitments have come from in this case. So I then turn to really to deal with points 2, 3 and 4 together as they've been raised. If I start with Tondra Tom's comments, where for reasons really associated as much with the implementation of strategic sites and buffer, she argues that the overall residual requirement is not the 1280 we've identified, but should be a figure of 1817. Well, so for reasons that we'll come to, and Ms. Henstock can explain in greater detail shortly in relation to the reliance that's been placed on the strategic sites. I don't accept that 1817 is the right figure, but I just want to put it in context because, as you know, we are over providing in this case. And if you look at the level that the plan is actually providing for, we're at a little over 1760 units. We are just effectively 50 shy of where Tondra Tom suggests we should be, assuming 1280 is the correct figure. If her criticism or her comment that in fact we've already missed 69 units off the list is right, then the allocations in the plan are pretty well bang on the money for where she says the need ought to be. And so that's why it's sensible that there is a degree of over provision in the plan, because it meets the uncertainties that there may be in terms of whether or not the strategic sites will deliver at the rate that they do. And so there is, as it were, an allowance already of over 400 units there, or 500 units to address that concern. What one wouldn't do is take the concern or the 1817, which Ms. Tom puts forward as the figure, on a sort of worst case scenario, and then add a further buffer to that. We believe that the 1280 is a reasonable scenario. You add in a buffer that takes us up to 18 or 1700 odd, which is a good worst case scenario, not very far away from Ms. Tom's figure. And so in those circumstances, we say we are actually at or about the right level on that analysis. Ms. Wilford's contribution in relation to C2, so it was a relatively short point, and the answer to it is similarly simple, that her point goes to whether or not there should be separate allocations specifically for C2, but that actually isn't relevant to the question you've asked about the overall level of need, because of course the 1280 units, the overall need, includes specialist housing within it. It's not a reason for adding additional housing over and above what's there. Mr. Black, sir, I'm going to park any response to what he's had to say about 5-year housing land supply until we get to that part of the discussion. And indeed, it may well be that a lot of what he said about housing delivery test also really should fall into that category. So just as one point of correction, I think it was Mr. Black, but if it wasn't, I apologise. It was certainly somebody quoted a completion figure for the last year of only of the order of 800 units. So if you look at the SADPD, in particular policy SA10, you'll see the figure that's given there for completions for 2019-2020. That figure is 1,003. So it's not 800, it's 1,003. Mr. De Black speculates that if we have the latest, when we get the latest housing delivery figures, the council is likely to be down on where it was last year. So that is speculation. We don't yet have those figures. All I can say is that although we don't have the published document yet, the indications I have from the council is that Mr. Black is some way wide of the mark. That is very much not where we expect to be. But that is, I can't evidence that at the moment because the document hasn't been produced. It is simply speculation as to where we might be. But if you're concerned about it, I would say wait and see what the document says. But we don't believe we will be there. And in that regard, I would very much endorse the point made by Mr. Grace on behalf of SOFLAG. Mid-Sussex, an area of strong housing market demand. And in fact, delivery here has been generally extraordinarily good and extraordinarily high. Turning to Mr. Murray Cox, who observed that even with allocations, there may be delays in them coming forward, there may be reductions as we discover that when sites come forward, in fact, it's not possible to deliver the number that the allocation or the draft allocation suggests. Well, in theory, sir, that may be the case, but the council's experience, as I'm sure Mr. Marsh and Ms. Henstock will be able to comment in due course, is that in practice, yield on sites is generally going up rather than down on the figure that is identified in the allocations, which, if anything, would again provides a degree of flexibility there. So I think the last thing I want to say before I turn over to Mr. Marsh and Ms. Henstock is picking up on Mr. Huff's observation, which I think was really echoed by Mr. Buckwell on the line, should you wait until the district plan review? There are plenty of sites around. And so in reality, this is, I think, your question 3.6, but I'll trail my answer or council's answer to it now. Obviously, sir, as Dr. Bowes has rightfully and helpfully pointed out, Sevenoaks, Tunbridge are not comparators. Although Mr. Huff says it was open to the inspector to decide there to carry on with those plans, having decided that there's a failure to meet the duty to cooperate, that's just obviously wrong. Duty to cooperate must tick box. If you fail at that hurdle, the plan is dead. There is no option, as you will know, for an inspector to say, although you failed the duty to cooperate, I still think half the plan is better than no plan at all, so I'm going to let you carry on. But in any event, sir, when one is looking at what Mr. Huff suggests is a toughening in the line of inspectors in your position in terms of whether or not plans should be allowed through on the basis of an undertaking of an early review. So there is a world of difference between an inspector in your position looking at an entire local plan and having a commitment from the local authority that it will begin the next stage review as soon as possible at a point in time where it has not even started that process, but it promises the examiner that will happen. There's a world of difference between that situation and where we are at the moment, which is we are not promising you that work will begin on the district plan. Work has already begun on the district plan. This is a daughter document, and at most we are looking in reality at 2 years between the adoption dates of the two, if we stick to the current timetable. And I do ask you, when thinking about the argument that you shouldn't wait now, that you should send us back to the drawing board, just to think about where that takes us, given the concerns that have been expressed about the trajectory, and given the certainty that would be created by early adoption of the site allocations plan. People have said, well, there's no difficulty in identifying additional sites. They're coming up your ears. You've got parties around this examination who are only too ready to throw their hat into the ring. And so that is certainly true. But that is only a part of the overall picture. At the moment, you are well aware of the extent to which allocations in Mid-Sussex are sensitive. There are considerations of AONB which constrain where sites may go. There are considerations in relation to Ashdown Forest which give rise to quite difficult questions on habitats. And in the event that you were to tell the council that we should go back and identify more sites, once we had a list of possible sites which otherwise pass scrutiny, the first thing we would need to do is run those through an entirely new transport assessment. And I'm told that that is something that, as a piece of work, that in itself would take something the order of 2 months to produce. Once we had that, but only once we had that, because it's only once we know where the traffic's going to go that we can then assess the impact on habitats, there would need to be an entirely new habitats regulation assessment looking at the impacts on Ashdown Forest, which is likely to take, I'm told, of the order of a further month. And that simply gets us to a point where the council, in terms of its good governance, could begin taking things through the normal committee process for approval to put these forward as a main modification. As main modifications, as you know, they would then need to go out to consultation. And it would be a matter for you, sir, in the light of that, whether you felt it was necessary to reopen this examination, something which certainly at this stage I don't think we could rule out, although you may well decide at that stage that you felt it was possible to deal with the points simply on the basis of written responses. But sir, what I'm trying to get to is that we're not looking simply at an exercise that could be carried out quickly in a couple of weeks. We are looking at a quite significant delay in terms of the adoption of this site allocations DPD in circumstances where the district plan is already following close on the heels. And one of the things that in those circumstances the council would ask you to think about very, very carefully is whether the delay in the adoption of the site allocations DPD, the daughter document, is justified or proportionate when there will be a district plan review coming close on its heels. Our answer to that is very definitely no, it would not. So at that stage, I'm going to turn to Mr. Marsh and then Ms. Henstock. Ms. Henstock in particular, I'm going to ask to deal with comments in relation to the trajectory as it relates to the strategic sites. And ask her just to explain to you what the tables in MSDC 01 are based on, that the level of conversation that we've had with the developers, in particular Homes England, and also to comment on the suggestions that have been made that it would be helpful to have an updated version of those in some sort of statement of common ground. But I go to Mr. Marsh first. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mine's just
Good morning, Andrew.
Morning, sir. Mine's just a general point on the issues raised, I think, by Mr. Black on the housing trajectory that we provide in document H2, the housing land supply note. And it is just to note really that obviously the district plan in DP4 sets out as an average 876 dwellings per annum for the first few years of the plan, and then it goes up to an average of 1090 from 24 to 25 onwards of the plan period. And of course, there's no suggestion that the council should be meeting 876 precisely every year. The nature of the plan process and the various components of it mean that some years you will be lower than 876 and some years you will be higher. And that's exactly what the trajectory sets out, in that if you look at the line, the annualised housing requirement, that takes account of the peaks and troughs within the plan period. And I think by our workings there, by the time you get to 23-24, with the sites DPD in place, our annual housing requirement falls below our district plan housing requirement because we've more than made up for any shortfalls at the beginning. The other thing to note, of course, the first in green there, the completions, the first few years, that was before the district plan was in place. And I think we would note at that point that we were reliant on any existing allocations. There were no additions to supply apart from commitments in planning applications that were out with a strategic plan in place. 2018, the district plan was adopted. Of course, the district plan includes a large range of strategic sites, which Henstock will talk about in a second. But it's noted in all of our work there is a lead-in time for those strategic sites. District plan adopted 2018. That lead-in time means that the delivery on those sites will be later than the first year or two of the plan period, as expected, and that's absolutely shown in the trajectory in front of you in H2. And of course, the sites DPD will, the adoption of the sites DPD will only add to that, and we've got a lead-in time, assuming adoption this year. We do include that lead-in time for the sites DPD sites. Of course, some of them may deliver quicker, and some of them fall further into the plan period, but that's all indicated in the trajectory. So that by the end of the plan, 2031, our housing requirement is met in full, albeit not precisely at 876 or 1090 a year. It respects the cyclical and sort of peaks and troughs arrangement of the planning system.
Thank you. So is Henstock next, or are you still speaking?
No, I'll take over now. Thank you very much. So just to provide some further clarification on the delivery of the Northern Arc, the strategic site that's allocated in the district plan. As we've mentioned, this site has been brought forward by Homes England. It's their flagship project. Obviously tasked with speedy delivery of housing. That is their remit of the project. So we work very closely with Homes England, both at planning officer level with the project manager who's tasked with dealing with the actual planning applications, all the way up to director level, both at Mid Sussex and at Homes England. So we are in regular communication with Homes England. In terms of the commitment that developers need to make, the first phase of the reserve matters has been tendered out to tender, and Bellway are now under contract to deliver that element. As part of that contract, they have had to make a commitment to timely delivery of the site. For example, they're required to submit a reserve matters application within 100 days of going under contract. That means that they need to submit the reserve matters by August of this year. In addition, the speed of delivery has been supported by asset and planning performance agreements, fortnightly meetings between planning officers of Bellway and ourselves who are dealing with the planning application. Means that by the time the planning application is actually submitted, a lot of the issues and matters would have already been resolved and dealt with up front, ensuring a timely decision is made on the reserve matters. So this all demonstrates that the accelerated delivery rates set out in the trajectory are achievable. A number of comments have also been made that the application is only an outline form, when in fact full permission has been granted for strategic pieces of infrastructure, in particular the link roads. And as you would have seen from your site visits to the sites in the Bedge Hill area, contractors are actually on site and putting the necessarily highway infrastructure in place. We've set out in further detail in MSDC01 the levels of both public and private finance that have been put forward to support the strategic growth at Burgess Hill. And just to cover off the point in terms of statements of common ground, yes, we can go away and perhaps present the information in a clearer form in terms of phasing, and we can look to get statements from the site promoters and developers in terms of to confirm their anticipated delivery rates on the sites. whilst the Northern Arc is a large site, it will be, as I've indicated, being brought forward at multiple outlets at different locations across the site, all selling a different type of product. So therefore, accelerating delivery rates and sales rates across the site. Site will be brought forward both on the eastern side and the western side in tandem, but through different developer partners.
Thank you for that. That will be helpful to have a clarification. I do like the suggestion made by one or two of the other parties that you get together with them and put that into a statement of common ground. And if you can get the comments of the promoters as well, that would be really helpful. So
we
I think
can do that. It may, given that there are different sites, it may be 3 different documents rather than one. If we can put it in one, then we'll certainly do that.
that's not a problem.
Yeah.
But I would like that done over the 4 strategic sites.
Yeah.
And do you know roughly how quickly that could be done, or do you want some time to think about that and come back to me?
So given that it involves other parties, can we take that away and report back to you either at the end of today or certainly by the end of this week?
It's very helpful.
Well, I'm aware of 2 things. Firstly, the people within the council who are sitting at this examination at the moment and therefore have things on their hands, but also it will need conversations to be had with other parties. So we'll let you know, sir, but we will endeavour to get it as soon as possible, recognising, of course, that other parties will want the opportunity to comment on it once it's been produced.
Of course. Well, I'll get part of that in the statement of common ground, because you'll presumably have bits that you agree on and bits you don't.
Possibly.
I agree with you. It should also go out to everybody else. Yeah. Thank you for that. Was there anything else from the council? Andrew Marsh, I've got your name down on my screen. Do you want to comment further?
No, nothing further from me, sir. No.
Right. Right, I've got some people who would like to contribute on this. Chris Huff, come in, please.
It's gone.
You're there.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, just having trouble with my delete and whatever buttons. Just coming back on 1 or 2 of the points, mainly I think Paul Brown in responding to my points. First of all, to the black hole point of the change in the figures since the district plan. It's thank you for that explanation. It's what I expected. It's from large windfalls. Well, we're dealing with a plan-led system, and we're dealing with a plan that should identify the sites, and there should be no large windfalls. And I think that is a testimony to the shortcomings of the existing district plan, and we shouldn't go down that same route. We should follow the route of identifying everything rather than leaving the planning system to bring forward large windfalls. That's the first point. Sevenoaks, Tonbridge, a bit of legal sparring here. It probably isn't of much interest to you, because your main, or the main point I want you to consider here is how firm a line you take on the housing provision, the possibility of a future review. We all know that if an inspector is not happy with the housing provision when looking at a plan from the outset, there are different routes they can take. In some cases, they can take a duty to cooperate point, which is, as Mr. Brown said, an absolute point. But in fact, the same point was considered by Jonathan Bohr on this plan previously. He had severe misgivings about the duty to cooperate. He overcome it. I hesitate to use the word fudge, but he overcame it by having a step trajectory, and also saying that in the case of the other areas, the neighbouring areas, their positions weren't sufficiently far advanced for him to feel that there was a failure of the duty to cooperate. So what I'm saying is there's ways and means. It's legal wrangling. It's not really an important point for you. It's an point of really whether you're prepared to say, well, if there are problems here, we can deal with them on a jam tomorrow basis. Now, in terms of that jam tomorrow basis, I disagree with Mr. Brown. It's not going back to the drawing board. It's far from it. It's considering some sites or bringing into the play some sites which have already been extensively assessed and are there for the taking. Any delay in that is in the hands of the council and how quickly they act on that. And I would have thought they could act very quickly. In terms of all the other problems that are identified, in particular the transport assessment and the habitats regulations, this is something which really is history. It was dealt its final blow, we all hoped, with the failure of the Wealden local plan. And it was quite clear there that the Ashdown Forest is being addressed by management methods with English nature, rather than restricting development in other areas. Now, the number of dwellings we're talking about to bring it up to the flexibility level we're suggesting is about 650. That is not a very high figure in terms of the effect on the transport network and the Ashdown Forest, particularly when you spread that over the planned period, and also take into account the electric cars and all the decrease in emissions that we're talking about. So previously, as I did mention, the Hassock site came in the middle of examination without any difficulty in terms of transport assessment, even when that issue was at its greatest. So I think these are not important problems to have to be addressed. What you do need to, or a point I do need to make to you, sir, is that, again, taking Mr. Brown's very firm legal point on it, your alternative is to make the plan unsound. Now, that is not, or to find the plan unsound, that is not what anybody wants. And therefore, I think dealing with this issue by way of interim conclusions is far better than the alternative of the plan being unsound. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Ashley Bowes.
I'm grateful, sir, just to come back on the council's response, where it helpfully confirmed that it's already started work on the review, and it anticipates that takes around 2 years to complete. And the consequence of that is, we say, that this document, therefore, needs to make sure there's a robust land supply for the interim period between between now and the review being completed, the whole strategy and a new strategy going forward. It doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that this document needs to plan all the way to 2031 as it's intended, because, of course, a review is already underway, which is anticipated to be completed within 2 years. And even if, of course, that slips, as these things do, notwithstanding the best efforts of council officers and members, that's still likely to be completed well before 2031. The consequence of that is, of course, that this document meets in spades a 2 to 3 to 4 year land supply for that interim period. And critically, and most importantly, it does so, if you look, as you would have done, sir, at page 47 onwards of the essay, which lists what those 20 constant sites are, it does so by relying on small to medium scale sites. There are none of those are of a strategic scale, as is unsurprising for a document of this nature. Some of them are as low as 12 to 10 units. They are not of a scale where one would expect large to complex infrastructure to hold up delivery, where you'd have lots of complicated land ownership issues, land assembly issues to get in place, where you might be thinking you'd need a large buffer. And of course, all of that is in the context of what appears to be common ground between us and the council of a strong market area. And we note that agreement and endorse it. And we say, well, in the context of a strong market area, in the context of small to moderate scale housing, where there's unlikely to be lots of complicated issues to resolve which lead to delay, a 10% buffer is perfectly appropriate. And that's why we say that nothing more than the 20 constant sites is necessary. Thank you for allowing me to come back on that, sir.
Thank you. Sandra Tom.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, firstly, I would echo Mr. Huff's points there. And referring to a review of the local plan, just draw your attention to the council's response to matter 1 and paragraph 2.9, something we have also mentioned in our meta statements and regulation 19 representation, is that no conclusions have been reached on whether the policies in the district plan require review or amendment, but it's through that process that strategic policies would be updated. Now, of course, if the council review their plan and consider they are delivering against their own policies, and indeed their own housing need hasn't risen significantly through the standard methodology, they may conclude no further action is required. So there's no guarantee that these matters would get picked up, and neighbouring authorities such as Lewis's housing need would necessarily get picked up through a review of their own plan. So that was the just point 1 there. And secondly, I believe that you asked the question to the council if they still stand by the tables that they submitted in response to your initial questions. And I don't believe that question has been answered. And in particular, with reference to the North and Northwest Burgess Hill, in that table on page 20 of their response to your initial questions, they have 77 units being delivered from the North and West Burgess Hill for last financial year, which haven't been delivered. Just following on from Ms. Henstock's comment that the application for reserve matters would be submitted in August, that would mean within 7 months of the submission of that, 209 completions would need to materialise, which we say is unrealistic. And I would think, therefore, that it would be very hard for the council to stand by that table on page 20. Thank you.
Hopefully all will be revealed when we get this clarification. And I look forward to hearing more from the council later in the day or whenever is practically convenient for them. Right. Let's move on to matter 3.2, which is on the distribution of new homes. And little Roman 1 there is on sustainable patterns of growth. And the council's comments, which are quite detailed. If I can summarise them as succinctly as I can. Council is stating that the proposed distribution of allocations in the DPD is consistent with the sustainable pattern of growth established within the district plan. And they refer me to a range of environmental criteria, which they have taken seriously. And they look at the AONB to begin with, and a robust assessment of sites within the AONB in their document TP1, and selecting only sites that they consider were not major. They say that in this they were supported by the High Weald AONB unit and Natural England, and that only 1.1% of the total planned period supply, that's of the 16,874 dwellings, applies to AONB. Therefore, as regards the AONB is concerned, they say only a limited growth in the AONB is proposed, and that's in accordance with NPPF 172. And in the context of 50% of the district being within the AONB. We then touch on the South Downs National Park and 3 particular sites which are within the setting of that park, SA12, SA13, SA24, and that they have a statement of common ground with the National Park Authority, confirming ongoing engagement, and that these sites can accommodate developments. I say we'll be having South Downs National Park talking to us during the course of this examination, and in fact the AOB unit, so we'll be able to get their input on that. Then the council draw my attention to Ashdown Forest and refer me to the policy DP17 in the district plan to avoid an avoidance and mitigation strategy through the SANGs and the SAMMs, which aligns with the strategic solution. And again, they say this approach is supported by Natural England. And they have a site, as we've already heard, at SA20, near Imberhorn Upper School site, or near there, to the west, where there will be there's a SANG to manage visitors on site. Also a strategy to manage visitors on site at Ashdown Forest. Again, in accordance with DP17 says, or in addition to that, should I say. We also refer to SA Gen, the policy that we're wondering whether it should be in or not, saying that policy requires housing allocations within the 7-kilometre area of influence of Ashdown Forest to provide mitigation in accordance with DP17. They touch on other environmental constraints. So we've got, for example, wildlife, landscape conservation, flood risk, for example. So their response to my question has laid down a strong marker in relation to environmental considerations. Grace Makin, on behalf of SOFLAG and the Town Council of Burgess Hill, state the proposed allocation of sites SA12 and 13 is not considered to accord with the principles of sustainable development, will result in an imbalance and harmful distribution of residential development in the district, will create significant detrimental impacts upon the landscape character and setting of South Downs National Park, as well as biodiversity and ecological assets. And in their statement, they helpfully give me a detailed list of both protected species and other species that are common to the area, which demonstrates effectively the ecological value of the area. So thank you for that list. Then DHA planning state that 6 of the proposed allocations are located within the AONB and will cumulatively deliver 243 dwellings. They consider this is not justified when there are suitable, available and deliverable sites in sustainable locations outside the AONB, and they mention Courthouse Farm at Copthorne in a Category 2 village. Nexus planning state that fresh consideration should be given to constraints, including the AONB National Park setting in Ashdown Forest 7-kilometre zone, in order to promote a sustainable pattern of growth, something they allege the plan currently fails to do. Turley for A2 Dominion state that Mid Sussex has a strategically important relationship with Crawley, which has a significant unmet housing need, and there is a substantial planning justification for providing housing in a manner which is well related to Crawley. As a slightly irrelevant throwaway comment, the MP for Mid Sussex was on Any Questions about 2 weeks ago, and she actually stressed as one of her points the close relationship with Crawley and Gatwick. So that point is made at least by your MP, although she hasn't contributed to the plan, so it's arguable whether that's evidence or not. Getting back to more serious matters, Judith Ashton Associates for Waits Developments Limited state the distribution of additional new homes in the plan allocations does not accord with the principles of sustainable development as set out in policies DP4 to DP6, and that the level of growth directed to category 2 and 3 settlements is significantly less than that identified in the district plan. And I do ask a question as to, as I get this all the time in plans where you've got lower order settlements, and the question I suppose is what's more sustainable, focusing heavily on your main towns, or in fact opening that up to a more scattergun effect on towns lower down the hierarchy. So it would be interesting for a view from this council as to whether they feel that the changes in this plan in relation to the numbers, and they're around between 100 and 200 sort of numbers, within the residual amount, are they significant? Question. Just coming back to what people have said, DMH Stallard for Sigma Homes. Just take some water. The DMH Stallard for Sigma Homes, that this plan accords with the settlement hierarchy set out in DP6, directing the majority of development towards category 1 settlements, which are the most sustainable settlements in mid-Sussex. Although they feel that more perhaps could go to Haywards Heath, although I can recall the comment back from Mr. Brown yesterday on how Haywards Heath has fared in other ways in terms of development. Savills for Charterhouse Strategic Land. The proposals do not wholly accord with the principles of sustainable development in their view. That there's a substantial bias towards category 1 settlements, mainly within Burgess Hill and also in East Grinstead. But the category 3 sites are 133 dwellings short of the DP figure. Category 2 sites are 93 dwellings short. This needs to be rebalanced and further allocations included in the plan. Litchfields for Whitehall Homes Limited. The plan suppresses growth in sustainable locations, and they're referring back to the Albourne appeal decision, which we're going to look at a few stations down the track, as it were. JLL for Waite Development. The plan does not reflect the adopted plan, does not consider the social and economic benefits of non-delivery of homes in categories 2 and 3. And they also quote to, or refer me to the fact that there's a lot of employment land around Bolney and no housing. And in the interests of a work-life balance, as it were, or homes jobs balance, should there not be some housing in that area in relation to the employment sites? That's an interesting point. Maybe a reply on that would be helpful. Denton Homes strongly agree that the upper tier of the settlement hierarchy should have the most sustainable locations. In recognition of the significant A and B coverage in the district, if A and B sites are needed, they should be reassessed. As the most sustainable and appropriate ones available, and suitable omission sites should have been allocated, including an increased provision at Ardingly, or is it Ardingly? I've heard somebody say. You have to forgive me for sometimes getting local pronunciations wrong. I'll do my best to put them right. Andrew Black, concerned that Haywards Heath receives a small amount. As I say, we had a debate on that yesterday. Of greater concern is that 1,764 dwellings are allocated in SA 12 to SA 33. Of those, 523, that's 30%, are within or in close proximity to the SDMP or the AONB. Gladman Developments Limited, that the proposed distribution of additional new homes does not fully accord with the principles of sustainable development as set out in DP6, in particular in relation to the level of development proposed at local service centres. Feel they're underrepresented. Lawrence Foote for Lord John Lytton. The distribution of new homes is not accepted as logical or optimal, especially in and around East Grinstead, which needs to be accompanied by major east-west road improvement. And the final comment I've got from Infrastructure First is that Felbridge is not identified within the council settlement hierarchy, but in contrast, Ashurst Wood on the east side of East Grinstead is identified. They have approximately the same level of services. Why are they not why are they not both category 3 settlements? And going on to say that the proposed housing allocation at Felbridge in SA 19 will cause substantial harm to the status and character of the village, erode its separate identity, and result in a significant increase in private car journeys to access essential goods and services. We are, of course, going to be coming on to all the sites in 3.3 over a number of days, starting tomorrow. So I don't really want to get into detailed sites, detailed allocations today, but I realise that a cut-off point is not always that easy to completely divorce things. Right, that's my rendering of what people have said in relation to 3.2(1). Does the council want to kick off on this, or do you want to let everybody else go first and then come in at the end?
Just set the scene with some high-level sort of observations, which I'm sure they won't actually succeed in framing the debate, but I hope they might succeed in framing your consideration of the debate. So, I mean, the starting point, and it's a point we've made several times, it's the daughter document status of this, the settlement of the distribution. Your question relates to the distribution throughout the district. We have in the district plan policy DP6 a settlement hierarchy, and you have alongside that the table at page 37 of the district plan. So that table is not part of the policy itself. It's not binding. Nobody is suggesting that there's a requirement to absolutely hit each of those numbers in every single case. But so what is quite clear from its presence in the plan is that it informs the settlement of hierarchy, and it gives you some idea of the general level of distribution across the different tiers, which underpin the district plan itself and which were signed off by your colleague, Mr. Bohr. And we say that although there may be room for argument about the exact numbers, that in general terms, it is no part of the site allocations DPD to play around with or to alter that general strategy. We don't believe that the SADPD is a departure from it. We firmly believe that it's entirely consistent with that. And so I suppose the one exception for that relates to category 2 settlements, where it hasn't been possible to provide quite the number anticipated there. But we say that we've dealt with that in exactly the way that the plan anticipates in terms of the settlement hierarchy, which is to the extent that these numbers were a sort of policy off assessment, and we pushed the need to where it is most sustainably addressed, in other words, to settlements further up the list. And so that has two major implications for the discussion today. First, picking up on your comment about whether or not you describe it as a scattergun approach would be appropriate. We say the approach that is appropriate is the one that's set out in the district plan. People can describe that as scattergun or not scattergun. You can describe it how you like, but that is the approach that is appropriate, and it's the one which we believe we should be adopting. And this examination should not be reopening that question. Second, it's relevant in terms of the arguments about A, O, and B, because what on any analysis is clear from the text associated with DP6 settlement hierarchy, and what is made very clear in Inspector Bohr's report commenting on the last plan, is that underlying DP6 settlement hierarchy, underlying the distribution of sites across the district, is an expectation that there will be some development in the AONB. Not major development, but some development, that it's appropriate and necessary in order to support the sustainability of those communities, but also, as Mr. Bohr made very clear, that it's possible to do that without adverse effects on the AONB. And we say so that that principle is written into the district plan. And so when you have objectors saying to you today that we should go back to the starting blocks and AONB should be the last place that development would go, that is wrong. That argument has been had. It was had at the district plan stage. That is the framework within which this plan is brought forward. So the last thing that I want to say, just by way of overarching comment, is perhaps inevitably at the site allocations DPD stage, argument focuses on what the site allocations DPD is doing. And in particular, there is a tendency amongst a number of the objections to look at the allocations, or the number of allocations which are proposed in the SADPD for particular settlements, and to compare it with the table that you see on page 37. And the point that a number of people make is that, for example, the Haywards Heath gets off incredibly lightly in the site allocations DPD. Burgess Hill gets dumped on, is, put it crudely, the way that it's put. Well, so can I say in answer to that, and it's a point that I made in opening yesterday, the site allocations DPD is only one part of how the minimum residual requirement identified on page 37 is to be met. In the 2 years since then, a significant part of that need has already been addressed through commitments. And so, for example, if you look at MSDC 01, our answer to your initial questions, at page 26, simply in relation to East Grinstead and Haywards Heath, there's a table there which sets out for you the extent to which the minimum residual need, which one sees on page 37 of the plan, has already been addressed by East Grinstead and Haywards Heath in the sense of commitments and completions since then. And what one sees is that there are very significant levels of sites that are already coming forward or are commitments in both East Grinstead and Haywards Heath. And therefore, unsurprisingly, there is less need to allocate sites in the SADPD in order to get them up to the overall figures for those settlements that you see on page 37. That does not mean that the SADPD is disproportionate. It means that the SADPD is looking at the totality of the picture, and in our submission, any consideration you may give to whether the distribution is in accordance with the district plan has to bear in mind what is already committed in those particular areas. So those, I think, are my sort of overarching comments, hoping to set the scene for the debate that follows, but we'll see where it goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That's helpful to me. Hope it's helpful to everybody else. But I would like to take comments from other people. I've already got some hands up, so that's good. Mr. Black, you can come in first.
Thank you, sir. Just following on from what Mr. Brown took you through there, I would agree with what he said in terms of those comments that he's provided you with. Just some further commentary on some of those points, and just leading it on one step further, I've got 2 points to make, really. Firstly, in terms of what Mr. Brown was saying in terms of Haywards Heath and East Grinstead delivering against the residual requirement, that is quite right, and we agree with that, and we acknowledge that. However, it is just to say, and I think it was a point that someone else took you to the other day, Mr. Murray Cox, I think it was, that if you then look at the other categories, so I'm looking at table 2.5 in the plan and looking down that list of categories and comparing that to the residual requirements, it nevertheless, then you have a point where Crawley Down is delivering 50 units when the residual requirement is 0. Ashurst Wood is delivering 12 units when the residual requirement is 0. So is Handcross, and so is Anstey at lower stages of the settlement hierarchy. So that hasn't stopped the council looking at additional requirements, and those are in lower areas of the settlement hierarchy. And this goes back to the point of Mr. Brown suggesting that it's then been pushed back up to category 1, which we say it has, but Burgess Hill, and it still leads us to saying that Haywards Heath, with only 25 dwellings, and I took you to the percentages the other day, it is still a very low amount. And considering that in how you frame your question of enabling the most sustainable pattern of growth. And it's really our kind of, again, we are not convinced that that is the most sustainable pattern of growth. My other point, again, agreeing with Mr. Brown that the context of development in the AONB was agreed at the district plan examination back in 2018, and what Mr. Bohr said within his examination document, which you've seen, sir. I think then it's potentially important to think around, well, what's happened since 2018? And it's within our representations that we led you to this point where the planning practice guidance sets out how planning authorities should plan for biodiversity and GI and that's at paragraph 10. I've got the reference if it's helpful for you, sir.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah, so it's ID 8-010 -201 90721. Now that states that in planning, in plan making, it's useful for local authorities to consider the latest government policies that are relevant, and that includes the commitments in the 25-year environment plan. Now that wasn't obviously available at the time of the 2018 examination. And within that environment plan, you don't have to have it to hand, but there's a whole chapter in that, chapter 2, which the government has clearly set out their commitment to conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of national parks and AONBs. And that is an updated commitment that's been made since the council had the district plan allocated, and the planning practice guidance tells local authorities that they have to consider the latest government policies that are relevant. And we say, sir, that that is relevant. And that's notwithstanding the discussion that we will likely have on whether development is major or not in the High Weald AONB. Even if it isn't, and we say it's not, there still needs to be consideration to what government policies say. And we say that hasn't been borne out in this strategy in front of you. Thank you, sir.
Just hang on a minute while I put something down. Thank you for your patience. Right, Dr. Ashley Bowes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. May I bring in Mr. Grace?
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Comments will perhaps stray a little into little III in terms of the open countryside point that's coming up. But my comments are, we say that allocating more housing to Burgess Hill does not accord with the principles of sustainable development, particularly so to the most sensitive southern area of the town. And as you've highlighted, it will result in an imbalanced and harmful distribution of development. It will create significant detrimental impacts upon the landscape character and setting of the South Downs National Park, and it will create significant detrimental impacts upon assets of biodiversity and ecological value. Both SA 12 and 13 comprise of sites on the south side of Burgess Hill, adjacent to the National Park, but not simply land adjacent to Burgess Hill. And this is how an objective view of the site should be considered. In the case of SA 12, a very well used public footpath gives open views of the site, and both sites only some 200 to 400 metres away.
On your details on SA 12 and 13, I'm going to wait to consider these when we have the debate under 3.3.
Okay.
The reason why I'm saying that is there'll be other people here who will want to take part in that debate. And I just think it's fair for everybody to get the evidence at the same time on that. I know people can look at it through YouTube, but I think on balance it's probably helpful to everybody that I don't get into discussions on individual sites now. You will get your chance, I promise you.
Okay, then it's probably best that I wait, as I say, and then for that point, as I say, there is an integration of those points. So as I say, it's quite a bit to say.
You'll get your chance, I promise you. Judith Ashton.
Thank you, sir. In terms of distribution of development and compliance with policies DP4 and DP6 and direction of growth, I hear Mr. Brown now accepts that within category 2 settlements there is less than was envisaged within the district plan. And I know you, sir, have questioned this issue of, well, if you can't provide within the category 2 or 3 settlements, was it better to provide it within category 1 settlements because they are the more sustainable settlements? They might be, but there is the issue of balancing the spatial strategy to ensure that you are complying with the district plan's aims and objectives. And those aims and objectives are clearly set out on page 8 of the adopted district plan, and in particular I would draw you to the aims and objectives priority themes, they're called, about promoting economic vitality, and what they say about maintaining towns and villages, and also in terms of ensuring people live and work within their communities, reducing the need to commute. In addition, sir, if I may, I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 32 of Inspector Board's report, where he specifically refers to policy DP6 and the changes that were made to it through the main modifications. And in there, he actually says that this hierarchy, initially he talks about the hierarchy, and he goes on to say that my interim conclusions indicated that in the absence of such guidance, it was unsound because it did not provide strategic direction for site allocations, DPD, neighbouring plans, or for development management. There was a significant risk that unbalanced growth could take place in inappropriate locations, or that growth in sustainable locations could be suppressed. And our position, sir, is that growth in sustainable locations such as category 2 and 3 settlements is being suppressed. There are sites that have been actively promoted that can deliver, and we would submit, sir, are suitable sites that could have been allocated but haven't. Instead, the allocations have been directed up towards category 1 settlements, and in particular Burgess Hill. And we note, sir, also that the district council refer to the fact that one has to have regard to what's happening within the different settlements relative to what's been consented, completed, and what is currently within the commitments. But so you have no evidence in front of you to demonstrate that situation so that you can satisfy yourself that actually the spatial strategy within DP6 is being reflected properly within the site allocations document. I suggested in my statement that it would be quite simple for the district council to provide a simple table with accompanying appendices for each settlement, setting out what has been consented, what is a commitment, and what the residual requirement is as a result. And I think, sir, it might help you if the district council could do that, and also demonstrate to the rest of us making submissions on this point that in fact DP6 is being reflected properly through the site allocations plan. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Tim North Associates. Yeah, I'm can hear you.
Right, I'll try and get myself up there as well.
I see you. I can hear you.
If you can hear me, I'll continue if I may.
That's fine.
Being like yourself, I'm a dinosaur when it comes to technology. I'll be worse than you, I think, but we're getting things going.
Carry on.
Thank you. We're now operating. Right. My points are, first of all, can I just introduce myself? And I apologise I didn't do that yesterday. We represent Dukesfield Properties Limited, who own the IVD industrial estate in Ashurst Wood. So you've referred, I think, and others have referred to the fact that the buffer of 484 dwellings in the SA DPD is effectively all being provided in Category 1 settlements. You have also, I think, referred to a statistic which the council have relied upon, and that is 1.1% of the...
Not shredding paper at the same time, are you?
No, sir. No, sir. Not reading that. I'd like to do that.
Well, maybe it's not coming through you. There's some sort of interesting noise going on in the background. Doing something.
I can't give you a reason for that. No, nothing else going on here at all.
All right. Anyway, I'm sorry to.
If there's any interruption, I'll try and look. But certainly, there's nothing else going on here. So the other point you raised, I think, was your 1.1% of the sites in the SADPD being within the High Weald AOMB, and that, of course, is a figure relied upon when examining the totality of DP4 sites in the district plan. If I can just drill down on that a bit more, so the 6 sites which are allocated in the DPD, which are in the High Weald, 188 of those dwellings relate to effectively 6 sites, 4 of which amounting to 160 dwellings. All of those 4 sites are in excess of 20 units. And certainly in respect of SA25, I don't intend to go into that in any detail, but that is a site, as you know, west of Selsford Road, Ardingly, which is promoting 70 units, which effectively means that that is a major development requiring exceptional circumstances and public interest being procured through paragraph 172. Now, just taking those brief statistics for a moment, if you then look at the document produced by the District Council, that is MSDC-02C, you'll find, sir, that in terms of medium sized villages, category 3 settlements, there is a shortfall, and that shortfall is either 296 or 133 dwellings in the 13 category 3 medium sized villages, of which of course Ashurst Wood is one. Just to elaborate on that point, the figure of 296 dwellings is the difference between the housing supply figure found in policy SA10, that's table 2.3 in the regulation 19 version, and the minimum requirement figure set out in DP4 of the district plan. So that's a difference there of 296. The figure of 133 is the difference between the housing supply figure, which is proposed in policy SA11, that's table 2.5, again regulation 19 version, and the minimum residual housing need figure set out in policy SA10 of the same document. So we have, sir, a shortfall. Some people call it under provision, some people will call it other names, but there's certainly in category 3 settlements, whichever way you look at it, an under provision in the supply of housing. That brings me on to the next question, which is carefully set out again at paper MSDC-02C at paragraph 22.28, paragraph 2.28. And here is the justification which the council provides for looking at settlements, and there's 11 of them, 4 of which again are category 3 settlements, medium-sized villages, where there has been a sufficient commitments or completions to meet their minimum housing requirement. But as they quite, in my view, rightly say, this does not preclude the town or parish councils from identifying further sites in the neighbourhood plan in order to boost supply, before going on to add that the further sites may be allocated in the future to ensure the minimum residual for each settlement category. Now, that seems to be the basis for a suggestion that whilst these settlements have met their requirement in terms of commitments and completions, that should not be a bar to further development. And you may find it strange, but I entirely agree with that approach. I agree with that approach for several reasons. Firstly, it is a flexible approach, which is what the government is looking towards in the framework when looking at, for instance, paragraph 11A of the framework in the supply of future housing. It does represent, I think people have referred to it as a scattergun approach or a dispersed approach, which effectively, and I agree with Mr. Brown here, is what is said in the district plan. So this is nothing new. It just reflects the fact that there are sites which may come forward, and particularly those in category 3 settlements, to overcome what is the under provision or imbalance between supply and demand, as I've just indicated, the figures of 296 and 133. Where I depart from the district council is effectively in the distribution of these sites in these three, in category 3 settlements or in AOMB, because they seem to me to be large greenfield areas, and no consideration appears to be given to previously developed sites in other uses. And I go back to the point I made yesterday. There has been no assessment when examining potential sites in category 3 settlements of the contribution made by PDL land where it is in an existing employment use. And I think that is a fundamental error, if I might say so, on behalf of the methodology used by the council. Bringing all these points together, so I have 3 conclusions to make. First of all, there is a shortfall, imbalance, or under provision in category 3 medium-sized settlements. Secondly, sir, that is not, in my view, in order to overcome that imbalance or under provision.
Well, could you say it again? I didn't quite catch what you said.
Sorry. The first point, sir. The second point, sir, is that the methodology used to rectify that and the reliance placed on what effectively is 4 settlements in medium-sized villages is not the approach which should be adopted. There should be a more robust, wider view taken, certainly of sites which may be in other uses, including existing employment uses. And I say that, sir, because effectively that is what paragraph 120 and other paragraphs in the framework say. I think it's 60C. Thirdly, sir, my third conclusion point is this, that I do not think that it is appropriate in the light of what is said by the district council, where they say that further sites may be allocated in the future, that you should delay that process to a district plan review. It's this process, the DPD process, which should be addressing that point now rather than in the future. So those are my 3 conclusions on the importance of why, sir, I would ask you to look very carefully at the allocation of sites in Category 3, medium-sized village settlements, and with the possibility that there should be more, or at least a reappraisal of the sites which seem to be chosen and which, in my view, are inappropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Jonathan Buckwell, have you, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I think a lot of the points I was going to make have already been made by others, so I won't repeat those. But fundamentally, we just don't agree with the suggestion being made by the council that the AONB shouldn't be up for discussion at this point, simply because the district plan allows some development within it, which of course it does. But it's clear that the plan, specifically DP 16, does allow some development in the AONB where relevant tests are met, but that does not mean that the AONB should not be a significant consideration for the council and for you, sir, in deciding whether the sites that are now selected for allocation are appropriate. Just because national and existing adopted policies can allow development in the AONB doesn't mean that every site should then be allowed, especially where there are better and more sustainable options available. And critically, we also disagree with the council as to whether certain sites are or are not major development in the AONB. In particular, as we've set out in detail in our response on matter 4.2, sites SA25 and SA27 in particular are major development in our view. This is something that has to be carefully considered at this stage. As major development, there are wholly different NPF tests to meet here, and so this does go to the heart of the soundness of the plan. So we just can't agree with the council's suggestion that there's no need for discussion on this aspect now.
Chris Huff.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick point. Endorse what Paul Brown said on behalf of the council on this topic, and support the development hierarchy in the plan. I just wanted to make the point that category 2 settlements come out fairly poorly in the allocations DPD. In the adopted plan, they take up 18% of the total provision. That goes down to 6% in the draft allocations document. So in terms of the respective proportions, they've suffered in this allocations document. My response to that is that they should be the focus for the additional sites that it's my case should be provided. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Michael Brown, CPRE. Floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Michael Brown, representing the Sussex branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England. I know, sir, that you've said that you've read all the submissions. I am a little concerned, though, that you made no mention to the submission we made in your introduction to this section, and shared with others the points that we have made. I
do apologise.
That's all right. I'm just Paul Brown, in his introduction, suggests that there are some people who are suggesting there should be no development within the ANOB. If and insofar as that bullet was targeted at CPRE, it's misdirected, because we do support development within the villages within the High Weald insofar as required to meet local need. We take the comments made by your predecessor, Mr. Bohr, in relation to the district plan at face value, that the high Weald is appropriate for modest development. What we say is that that modest development should be related to the local need of the villages within the high Weald, and that the high Weald is not an appropriate place for market development in excess of local need. We say that because, first of all, there is a false distinction made, I think, by the council between smaller scale, or what Mr. Ball called modest scale development, and what paragraph 172 describes as major development, which requires exceptional circumstances. What we say is that whether or not development meets this major development test, para 172 says that that high Weald is entitled to the highest level of protection from development that is available under the planning system, and expressly says that any scale, any development should be limited in its scale and extent. And in that context, we would suggest to you that it is not sustainable to use the high Weald as a place for market development beyond what is needed for local needs, where there is alternative sites available that are no less sustainable than would be the case within the high Weald. Indeed, the high Weald is likely to be a highly unsustainable place for market development. It is likely to be remote from employment locations requiring transport, car transport. There may or may not be local provision of services for local people, and there may be well be a need for people to be very car dependent. It's bad for the environment and the ecology, irrespective of landscape quality. And in our view, the distribution of settlements should be such that any development within the ANOB is focused on local need, not oversupply. Thank you, sir.
Just before you go,
Yep.
You've mentioned the fact that you disagree with the figure that's in the plan now for SA25, the 70 units. You disagree with the council's classification. You feel it's a major development. Do you have any figure that you could give me as to what you consider to be a minor development for a place like Anston?
Well, I think I would take you back to the adopted Ardingly neighbourhood plan and the numbers in there that are consistent with the district plan. And from memory, I think they are talking about a local need of something in the order of 35 properties, which we would, if that is the, don't take the number as gospel, it's within the neighbourhood plan, but I think that's about the number, and that would seem to be a perfectly appropriate size of development to meet a local need, assuming the right mix of housing within that component.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. I'll take one more before coffee. Councillor Ian Gibson, please.
Thank you, sir. Can I start with just an observation back? I have no evidence of shortfall in strategic sites, but I'd just ask you to consider if you do ponder on that. I think, in my view, the most sustainable part of development in the district has proved to be the strategic sites, and I would not want to see any shortfall in strategic sites or assumed shortfall in strategic sites being transferred to the categories 1, 2, and 3 communities. But the point I want to make, and it's come up several times, is the extent to which DP6 has actually been followed in the process which has been followed, which has been applied. And I think it was Mr. Black who noted that several of the communities in the 27 communities shown there across the 4 categories were shown as having a minimum residual requirement of 0. Now, the problem that I have with the process that was used at this point is that no account has been taken of over delivery in any of the categories. And in particular, if I look at it, and the figures which I had were from April last year, 14 of the 27 settlements had met their DP target at that point. But in fact, they'd actually exceeded it by 670 new homes. Now, I appreciate not all of those are built. They're in the process of being built. There's a lot of construction work going around here in the north where I'm based. But that does not seem to have been taken into account in terms of the communities which have already delivered and over-delivered in the allocations which have gone forward. And that impacts on their sustainability because the district plan DP6 figures have been taken by local communities as realistic targets to achieve, realistic targets to deliver against. And that process really stems from the 2013 version of the plan and the briefings that were put out at that time and the neighbourhood plans that were developed, that you've already remarked that those neighbourhood plans had to be finalised in the absence of specific targets, which has created a problem certainly for the plan that I was involved with here in Crawley Down, but also across other plans in the areas where policies have been used rather than specific sites. So I just ask you, when you go forward with that, to be sure that you are recognising that communities that have delivered against the district plan, against the policy, should not be prejudiced further. And I've highlighted in the submission which I made into the consultation that there's 5 such communities that meet that point. And just on a point of information for you as we break for lunch, the MP in the north is actually Jeremy Quinn. I feel sure that he feels the same about Gatwick, but I would encourage you to think that we need to have diversity in the way that we recover from the pandemic. And certainly there's the opportunity to do that through the Science Park down at Burgess Hill. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. We'll break just in a minute for lunch, but this point about over delivery is an interesting one. Maybe that's something the council could consider and come back to me on. And my question really is, what are the downsides to over delivery, and are they factors that should be influencing the plan, or should we be taking the view that the minimum is the hurdle we get over? Anything above that is for the good. So that's a question set you all to consider. So we'll break now and we'll come back exactly on 2 o'clock. Thank you for that. And we've all got to negotiate ourselves out, haven't we, Charlotte?
I think we need to come back on a separate invitation.
Yes.
Come back on a separate invitation.
Yeah,
Yes,
need to log out of this session and come
log
back
out.
into the
Sorry,
afternoon session.
All right. Thanks very much. I will log out indeed. Right.